What most people misunderstand about empaths is that their silence on social media isn't fear, it's protection. We live in a world that rewards performance. The more you post, the more you exist. The more you share, the more you matter. But for empaths, that equation is completely reversed. Every time an empath puts themselves online, they don't just share a photo, they open a door. And through that door comes everything: the opinions, the energy, the judgment, the noise. Things that most people scroll past without a second thought. Hit an empath like a wave they didn't see coming, so they go quiet. Not because they have nothing to say, not because they're hiding, but because they've learned something that takes most people decades to understand. Not every space is safe for your real self. And social media, for empath, it's rarely safe. This isn't about being antisocial. This is about being so deeply social, so wired for real human connection, that the shallow, filtered, highlight reel version of connection that social media offers feels like eating cardboard when you're starving for a real meal. What you're about to hear isn't just about empaths and social media. It's about what it costs a deeply feeling person to live in a world built for people who feel less. Think about the last time you walked into a room that felt off. You couldn't explain it. Nobody said anything wrong. Nothing visibly happened. But something in the air felt heavy or tense or just not right. And while everyone else grabbed a drink and started laughing, you stood there, already tired, already processing, already carrying something that wasn't even yours to carry. That's not anxiety. That's not overthinking. That is what it means to be an empath. Empaths don't just notice emotions, they receive them. Like an antenna that never gets to switch off, an empath picks up on the emotional frequency of every person, every room, every exchange, consciously or not. It happens automatically. It happens constantly. And most of the time, it happens without a single word being spoken. Now take that experience, that deeply personal, deeply exhausting, deeply human experience, and place it inside social media. Social media is not a room. It's 10,000 rooms happening at the same time, with 10,000 people all broadcasting their pain, their anger, their loneliness, their celebration, their outrage, and their need for validation all at once on a screen that fits in your pocket, that you carry everywhere, that never closes. For someone who doesn't absorb energy the way an empath does, scrolling through a feed is just scrolling. It's passive, it's entertainment. You see a post, you react or you don't, and you move on. The content passes through you like water through a net. You catch a few things, most of it flows away. But for an empath, nothing just flows away. When an empath sees a post from someone in pain, they don't just observe the pain, they feel it land somewhere inside them. When they see an argument unfolding in a comment section, they don't just read the words, they feel the tension behind every sentence, the hurt underneath every insult, the desperation wrapped inside every aggressive reply. When they see someone performing happiness they clearly don't feel, the empath doesn't just notice the performance, they feel the gap between what's being shown and what's actually true. And that gap aches. This is not a metaphor, this is not an exaggeration. Research into high sensitivity and empathic processing shows that some people's nervous systems are genuinely wired to process emotional and sensory information more deeply than others. The part of the brain responsible for mirroring, for feeling what others feel, is significantly more active in people who identify as empaths or highly sensitive individuals. What feels like normal input to one person feels like an amplified signal to another. And social media is nothing but signal. Constant, unfiltered, uncontrollable signal. There is no preparation for what comes at you on a social media feed. There is no warning before the post about someone's loss. There is no boundary between the funny video and the heartbreaking news story right below it. There is no space to breathe between the argument and the celebration and the grief and the rage and the love. It all comes at the same speed, in the same format, with the same scroll motion between them. Nothing is cushioned, nothing is paced, everything arrives at the same volume. For an empath, this isn't just overwhelming, it's destabilizing. Because here is the part that most people miss. When an empath absorbs all of that energy, it doesn't just pass through them and disappear. It stays, it accumulates. It adds to what was already there from yesterday and the day before and the conversation they had last week that they're still carrying without realizing it. Empaths don't just feel things in the moment. They feel things in layers, and those layers build up over time into something that becomes genuinely difficult to separate from their own emotional state. This is why an empath can log off social media and still feel drained for hours. This is why they can spend 20 minutes on their phone and feel like they've just worked a full emotional shift. This is why, after a while, the very act of opening an app starts to feel like bracing for impact, because for an empath, that's exactly what it is, and it doesn't stop at consuming content. It gets worse when they think about creating it. Because if receiving all of that energy is exhausting, imagine what it feels like to put your own energy into that space. Imagine what it feels like as someone who senses everything to voluntarily send a piece of yourself, a thought, a feeling, a face, a voice, into an environment where you know, deeply and instinctively, that it will be received by people whose energy you cannot predict, cannot filter, and cannot protect yourself from. When an empath posts something online, they aren't just sharing content, they are extending themselves into an energetic space they cannot control. And the responses that come back, whether positive or negative, whether 10 of them or 10,000, all carry energy. A supportive comment carries energy. A critical comment carries energy. Even silence, even the absence of response, carries energy, the particular sting of feeling like you reached out and nobody reached back. Empaths feel all of it, not just the obvious stuff. Not just the cruel comments or the arguments. They feel the subtle dismissal in a half-hearted reply. They feel the performative kindness behind a like that has no real warmth in it. They feel the competitive undertone in someone's congratulations. They feel things that were never even meant to be communicated because their nervous system is built to read between every line that exists. So over time, many empaths arrive at the same quiet conclusion. The cost of being visible online is simply too high, not because they are weak, not because they lack confidence, not because they don't have something valuable to say, but because they have learned through their own experience that certain environments are not built for the way they are wired. And choosing to protect yourself from an environment that consistently depletes you is not retreat, it is intelligence. There is also something else happening beneath the surface that is worth naming directly. Empaths by their nature are wired for real connection, not performed connection, not curated connection. Real, honest, mutual, felt connection. The kind where two people are actually present with each other, actually hearing each other, actually letting each other in. Social media does not offer that. Social media offers the appearance of connection. It offers visibility, reach, engagement metrics, and the feeling of being seen without the vulnerability of actually being known. For most people, that's enough. It satisfies something. It fills a space. But for an empath, it doesn't fill anything. It highlights the emptiness. It shows them exactly what's missing. And interacting in a space that looks like connection but feels hollow is in many ways more painful than no connection at all. Because at least in silence, there is no pretending. So the empath retreats, they watch from the edges, they read without responding, they observe without participating. And the world looks at them and says, why are you so quiet? Why don't you share more? Why are you so private? Not understanding that the privacy is not absence, it is preservation. It is the empath saying, I know what this space costs me, and I have decided that I am worth more than what I lose every time I enter it unprotected. That is not weakness dressed up as wisdom. That is wisdom that took real pain to learn. The world will keep telling empaths to be more visible, more present, more open, more vocal, and some of them will try. Some of them will step into those spaces and do the work of managing the flood, and they will find ways to be there without losing themselves entirely. But many won't. Many will choose again and again to stay quiet in a noisy world, not because they have nothing to give, but because they know exactly how much they give, and they have decided to give it only where it can actually be felt. And in a world addicted to noise, choosing silence is the most radical thing a feelings person can do. There is a version of you that exists online, and then there is you. For most people, the gap between those two things is manageable. They share a highlight, they filter a photo, they craft a caption, and they don't lose sleep over the distance between what they posted and who they actually are. The performance feels normal because the world has normalized it. Everyone is doing it. So it stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like just how things are done. But for an empath, that gap is not manageable. It is unbearable. Authenticity is not a preference for empaths. It is not a personality trait or a value they've chosen to prioritize. It is a core psychological need, as fundamental as rest, as necessary as air. When an empath is not able to show up as who they truly are, something inside them doesn't just feel uncomfortable. Something inside them starts to quietly collapse. This is important to understand because it reframes everything. When people look at empaths and ask why they don't post more, why they don't build a presence, why they stay invisible on platforms where everyone else seems so comfortable, the assumption is usually that the empath is afraid. Afraid of judgment, afraid of rejection, afraid of being seen. And while fear can be part of it, that's not the root. The root is something far more specific and far more painful than fear. The root is that social media, by its very design, makes authentic self-expression almost impossible. And for someone who cannot function without authenticity, a space that makes authenticity impossible is not just uncomfortable. It is a space where they fundamentally cannot exist as themselves. Think about what social media actually rewards. It rewards consistency of image. It rewards a story about yourself that stays clean, coherent, and appealing across hundreds of posts over months and years. It rewards the version of your life that photographs well, the version of your thoughts that fits in a caption, the version of your emotions that gets engagement without making people scroll past too quickly. It rewards performance, always performance, whether the performance is polished and aspirational or raw and vulnerable, because even performed vulnerability is still a performance when it's crafted for an audience. And empaths feel the performance. That's the thing. They feel it everywhere. They feel it in their own hands when they try to write a post that's honest, but also palatable. They feel it in the moment they choose one photo over another. Not because one is more true, but because one will land better. They feel it in the slight shift that happens between thinking something and typing it for public consumption, that invisible editorial process where the realness gets quietly sanded down into something more acceptable, more digestible, more safe. For most people, that editorial process is just practical. You learn what to share and what to keep private. You find a balance, it becomes second nature. For an empath, it feels like self-betrayal. Because empaths are not just sensitive to the emotions of others, they are exquisitely sensitive to their own internal truth. They know in real time the exact distance between what they are expressing and what they actually feel. And every time that distance grows, every time they soften something to avoid conflict, or perform enthusiasm they don't have, or stay silent about something that matters to them because the audience isn't ready for it, they feel it. not as a vague discomfort, as a very specific kind of internal pain that is hard to name but impossible to ignore. It is the pain of not being met as who you are. And when the thing preventing you from being met is your own hand, your own choices, your own edits, your own performance, that pain has nowhere to go. You can't be angry at someone else for it. You have to sit with the quiet knowledge that you participated in your own disappearance. That is what social media asks empaths to do over and over again. Disappear a little, adjust, perform. Be real but not too real. Be vulnerable but make the vulnerability attractive. Share yourself, but share the version that gets likes, not the version that might make people uncomfortable or confused or uninterested. And empaths, who have often spent their entire lives already working to fit themselves into spaces that weren't built for them, already editing themselves in conversations and relationships and rooms just to be tolerated, eventually reach a point where they simply refuse to do it anymore. Especially in a space that isn't even offering them real connection in return. Because here is what makes this particularly hard for empaths. They are not afraid of depth. They are not afraid of honesty. They are not afraid of the parts of human experience that are messy and complicated and hard to look at. In fact, those are the parts they are most drawn to. Those are the conversations they most want to have. The real ones. The ones where nobody is performing and nobody is managing impressions and everyone is just telling the truth about what it actually feels like to be alive. Social media almost never offers that. And when it does, when someone breaks open and shares something genuinely, painfully true, it is usually met with a performance of support. With heart emojis and sending love comments and shares that are more about the sharer signaling their own empathy than about actually receiving the person who was brave enough to be honest. The empath sees through all of it. They see the authentic moment being processed through the same performative machine, and it breaks something in them a little. So they stop trying to pour their real self into a container that was never designed to hold it. This is also about something deeper than just what gets posted. It is about identity. Empaths have a strong, clear sense of who they are on the inside. Even if the outside world rarely gets to see it, they know what they actually think. They know what they actually feel. They know what they actually believe. And they take that inner life seriously. It is not something to be packaged and marketed. It is something to be protected. When social media asks them to turn their inner life into content, into something consumable, shareable, rateable, it is not just asking them to perform. It is asking them to commodify something they consider sacred. And that request, whether it is made explicitly or just implied by the culture of the platform, feels like a violation. Not a dramatic one, but a quiet, persistent one that accumulates over time into something that feels deeply wrong. There is also the reality of what happens when an empath does try to show up authentically online. They share something true, something they actually feel or believe, and the response they receive is filtered through other people's projections, assumptions, and needs. People don't see what was actually shared, they see what they want to see, or what confirms what they already think, or what they can use to feel something about themselves. The empath watches their real self get interpreted, misread, and reflected back to them in shapes they don't recognize. And that experience of reaching out with something genuine and having it returned to you distorted is not just frustrating. For an empath, it is deeply disorienting. Because empaths don't just want to be seen. They want to be seen accurately. They want the version of them that lands in another person's mind to actually resemble the version that exists in reality. And social media, with its noise and its speed and its endless layers of projection, makes accurate perception nearly impossible. So they go quiet, not because they have nothing worth saying, but because they have too much worth saying to let it be reduced to content. The most authentic thing an empath can do in a world that demands performance is to refuse to perform and live their whole, unfiltered, unpackaged truth somewhere the algorithm will never reach. There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't come from being hurt. It comes from being misunderstood. And if you have never felt the full weight of that, if misunderstanding has always been, for you, a minor frustration you shake off and move past, then what I'm about to describe might sound like an overreaction. But stay with it, because for an empath, being misread is not a minor inconvenience. It is one of the most quietly devastating experiences a human being can go through. To understand why, you have to understand how an empath relates to meaning. Most people communicate in shorthand. They say something, it lands roughly the way they intended. Close enough is good enough, and the conversation moves forward. They are not deeply attached to the precise interpretation of their words. They are not tracking, in real time, how the other person is receiving them. They say what they say, and they let it go. Empaths don't work that way. When an empath speaks, whether in words, in writing, in the way they show up in a room, they are not just conveying information, they are conveying layers. There is what they are saying, and there is what they mean beneath that, and there is the feeling behind the meaning, and there is the specific reason they chose those words and not different ones. Every expression an empath puts into the world carries more weight than it appears to carry on the surface. And they know that. They are aware of every layer as they're communicating it. So when someone receives only the surface, when someone reads the words and misses everything underneath, the empath doesn't just feel misunderstood, they feel erased. Like the most important part of what they offered was invisible. Like they reached out a full hand and the other person only shook one finger. Now bring that experience into social media, where surface level reception is not the exception, it is the rule. Social media compresses everything. A thought that took days to form gets read in 4 seconds. A feeling that lives at the bottom of someone's chest, complex, layered, difficult to name, gets reduced to a caption. The full human behind the post is invisible. What's visible is a small edited fragment. And that fragment gets interpreted not based on who the person actually is, but based on whoever is doing the reading, their mood that day, their own history, their assumptions, their need to categorize things quickly and move on. For most people, this is just the cost of participating online. You accept that you will be partially misread, you develop a thick enough skin to absorb it, and you keep going. But for an empath, that cost is not something they can simply absorb and continue, because the misreading doesn't stay on the surface, it goes in. Here is what actually happens inside an empath when they are misunderstood. They don't just register the incorrect interpretation and file a correction. They feel the distance between who they are and who they have just been seen as. And that distance is not abstract, it has a texture, a weight, a specific emotional quality that sits in the body. It feels like being handed a mirror that shows someone else's face. You keep looking at it, trying to find yourself in it, and you can't. And something about that experience, that inability to find yourself in how someone else sees you, triggers something very old and very deep. Because for many empaths, being misunderstood is not a new wound, it is an old one. Most empaths grew up feeling like they didn't quite fit, like they were too sensitive, too intense, too much, or too quiet for the world around them. They grew up having their reactions dismissed as overreactions, their depth mistaken for difficulty, their silence mistaken for coldness, their care mistaken for weakness. And they learned early that the world often sees them wrong. Social media doesn't heal that wound, it reopens it repeatedly, at scale, because now it's not just one person misreading them, it's dozens or thousands. And each misreading carries its own particular flavor. The person who reads sincerity as sarcasm, the person who reads nuance as contradiction, the person who reads vulnerability as attention-seeking, the person who takes one sentence out of a paragraph and uses it to define everything about who you are. The empath feels all of it, not as separate incidents, as a cumulative assault on their sense of self. And the thing about being misread publicly is that it is very hard to correct. In a private conversation, if someone misunderstands you, you can pause, you can clarify. You can look them in the eye and say, that's not what I meant, and here is what I actually meant. And you can feel in real time whether the correction lands. There is a human loop. There is a chance for the real you to come through. Online, there is no such loop. By the time you try to clarify, the misreading has already spread. People have already responded to the version of you that doesn't exist. They have already formed opinions, shared their reactions, moved on. The correction goes largely unread because the original post already shaped the narrative. And the empath is left standing in the aftermath of a version of themselves they never were, trying to figure out how to reclaim something that was never accurately represented in the first place. This is not paranoia. This is not the empath being too precious about how they are perceived. This is a very rational response to a very real dynamic. And the reason it hits empaths harder than most is not that they are fragile, it is that they are precise. They are extraordinarily precise about meaning, about intention, about the truth of what they are trying to communicate. And precision in a space that cannot hold precision is not a gift. It is a source of constant pain. There is also another layer to this that is worth naming. Empaths are not only sensitive to being misread themselves, they are sensitive to the act of misreading in general. When they watch it happen to other people online, when they see someone's words get twisted, their intentions get flattened, their humanity get reduced to a punchline or a villain, the empath doesn't just observe that. They feel it as if it's happening to them. They feel the injustice of it. They feel the helplessness of the person being misread. And they carry that too. So social media becomes, for the empath, a place where they are constantly witnessing the distortion of human beings. Others being collapsed into categories, others being seen wrong, others being punished for not being understood. And the empath absorbs all of that as a warning about what will happen if they step forward. What will happen if they let themselves be seen in a space that routinely sees people wrong? The warning is not irrational. It is based on evidence. It is based on everything they have observed and everything they have felt. It is the empath's nervous system doing what it was built to do, reading the environment, assessing the risk, and offering a very clear signal. This place will not see you the way you actually are. And you know what it costs you when that happens. So choose carefully, and many empaths choose silence. Not because they are cowards, not because they don't believe in themselves, but because they believe in themselves enough to know that a space which cannot hold them accurately is a space that doesn't deserve them fully. They would rather be unknown than be known wrong. They would rather exist in private truth than in public distortion. They would rather hold the wholeness of who they are quietly to themselves than hand it to a machine that will fragment it, flatten it, and reflect it back at them in pieces they don't recognize. That is not hiding. That is the highest form of self-respect. Knowing that your truth is too precise for spaces that only deal in approximations, there is a moment that most empaths know well. It is the moment after they have spent too long in the wrong environment, too long absorbing, too long giving, too long being open in a space that took everything they offered and gave nothing sustainable back. It is the moment they finally close the door, sit down in the quiet, and feel the full weight of what it just cost them to be there. That moment is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives as a kind of hollowness, a flatness. An exhaustion that sleep doesn't fully fix because it isn't physical tiredness. It is the tiredness of a self that has been stretched too far in too many directions for too long. Most empaths have felt that moment after social media, and at some point they make a decision, not always consciously, not always with a clear plan, but a decision that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. I cannot keep doing this to myself. That decision is a boundary. And understanding what that boundary actually is, where it comes from, what it protects, and why it takes real strength to hold it is essential. Because the world has a habit of looking at an empath's silence and calling it weakness, calling it fear, calling it a problem to be solved, when in reality it is one of the most psychologically intelligent moves a deeply feeling person can make. A boundary, at its core, is not a wall. People confuse the two constantly. A wall is built to keep everything out permanently without discrimination. A wall says nothing gets through. A boundary is different. A boundary is a door with a lock, and the empath holds the key. It says, I decide what comes in, and I decide what I give out, and I decide the terms under which I engage with any given space. A boundary is not the absence of connection. It is the protection of the conditions that make real connection possible. When an empath steps back from social media, they are not shutting the world out. They are shutting a specific kind of noise out, the kind that overwhelms their system, distorts their sense of self, and drains the very reserves they need to show up fully in the relationships and spaces that actually matter to them. They are making a distinction that most people never have to make so deliberately, the difference between connection that restores and exposure that depletes. That distinction is not instinctive for everyone. For people who are not wired the way empaths are, exposure and connection often feel like the same thing. Being visible feels like being connected. Having followers feels like having community. Getting engagement feels like being understood. But for an empath, those things are not the same. They have never been the same. And learning to honor that difference, to stop pretending that performing visibility online is equivalent to the deep, felt connection their nervous system actually needs, is a form of radical self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is not passive. It requires something from you. It requires you to look honestly at what certain environments do to you, even when those environments are ones the whole world seems to be thriving in. It requires you to resist the social pressure that says if everyone else can handle this, something must be wrong with you for not being able to. It requires you to trust your own experience over the dominant cultural narrative. That is not easy. It takes genuine courage to say, I see what this space is, I understand what it costs me, and I am choosing myself over the pressure to participate. That choice is the boundary. And holding it is an ongoing act, not a one-time event, because the pressure to be on social media does not stay outside the empath, it gets internalized. They feel it from the people around them who wonder why they aren't online. They feel it in conversations where someone says, why don't you post? As if the answer should be simple, as if there must be a quick fix for whatever is holding them back. They feel it in the moments they watch others build communities and connections through platforms they've stepped away from, and a part of them wonders if they made the wrong call. They feel it in the cultural message that runs beneath everything, that in the modern world, if you're not visible, you don't fully count. Holding a boundary against that kind of pressure requires the empath to come back again and again to the same foundational truth. I know what this does to me, not what it does to someone else. Not what it should do to me in theory, what it actually does to me in my body, in my emotional state, in my capacity to function and feel and connect in the ways that matter most to me. That knowledge is the anchor. And the boundary is built around that anchor, not around rules, not around fear, but around a clear-eyed understanding of what this empath specifically needs to stay whole. This is also about energy in a very practical sense. Empaths have a finite amount of emotional and energetic resources available to them at any given time. And those resources are depleted faster than they are for most people, because everything costs more when you feel everything more deeply. Every interaction carries more weight. Every piece of content lands with more force. Every exchange requires more processing, which means recovery takes longer and the reserves run lower before they get a chance to refill. In that context, choosing where to spend energy is not a luxury. It is a survival strategy. An empath who pours their limited emotional resources into navigating the noise, hostility, and performance of social media has less left for the people they love, the work they care about, the creative and internal life that gives them meaning. The boundary around social media is not selfish. It is how the empath remains capable of generosity everywhere else. It is how they protect the well so that the people who genuinely need them can still find water there. There is something else that the boundary protects that is harder to name, but perhaps more important than anything else. It protects the empath's inner world. The quiet interior life that is, for most empaths, the source of everything. Their creativity, their insight, their capacity for deep feeling, their ability to hold space for others. That inner world is not robust in the way that people assume. It is not a fixed resource that remains intact no matter what the external environment looks like. It is sensitive, it is responsive. It is shaped in real time by what the empath allows in. When an empath lets social media in without boundaries, the inner world gets colonized. The noise of the platform starts living inside them, even when they're not on it. The comparisons, the outrage, the performance, it all takes up residence in the interior space that was supposed to be theirs alone. And when that happens, the empath loses access to the very thing that makes them who they are. The quiet disappears, the depth becomes hard to reach, the creativity dries up, the clarity goes cloudy. The boundary is how the empath keeps that from happening. It is how they preserve the silence inside themselves that the outside world keeps trying to fill. It is how they stay in contact with their own truth in a world that is constantly offering them other people's noise as a substitute. And none of this is weakness dressed in different language. Weakness would be continuing to walk into a space that consistently breaks you down, telling yourself you should be able to handle it, ignoring every signal your body and mind are sending you, and sacrificing your wholeness on the altar of social expectation. What empaths do when they draw that line, when they say this space is not for me, and I'm choosing something different, that is not retreat. That is the kind of self-awareness that most people spend their entire lives trying to find. Setting a boundary is not giving up. It is finally deciding that you are worth protecting and having the clarity and the courage to act on that decision, regardless of what the world thinks it means about you. There is a kind of connection that cannot be measured. It cannot be counted in followers or quantified in engagement rates or summarized in the number of people who saw your post on any given Tuesday. It cannot be photographed or captioned or shared. It exists only in the space between two people who are fully present with each other, and it leaves a mark that no algorithm will ever be able to track. That is the kind of connection empaths are built for. And when you understand that, when you really sit with what that means, the empath's absence from social media stops looking like a limitation. It starts looking like a choice that is so deeply aligned with who they are that it could not have gone any other way. The world has developed a very specific idea of what connection looks like. It looks like reach, it looks like visibility. It looks like a number climbing upward. More followers, more views, more shares, more proof that you exist and that your existence registers in the minds of other people. Connection in the modern framework is something that can be scaled, something that can be optimized, something that gets better the larger and louder it becomes. Empaths live in a completely different framework. For them, connection does not scale, it deepens. And those are not the same direction. A connection that scales gets wider. It touches more people, covers more ground, reaches further into the world. A connection that deepens goes further into one person, into one moment, into one exchange that neither participant will forget because something real passed between them. One is about breadth. The other is about truth, and empaths are not built for breadth, they are built for truth. This is not a philosophical preference, it is a neurological reality. Empaths process interpersonal experience at a level of depth that most people simply don't access. When they are in genuine connection with another person, truly present, truly listening, truly letting that person's reality land inside them, they are doing something cognitively and emotionally complex that requires their full attention and their full self. There is no part of them that is elsewhere. There is no performance running in the background. There is just this person, this moment, this exchange. That experience is not replicable online. It cannot be compressed into a comment thread. It cannot be approximated by a DM or a voice note or even a video call where the empath is aware, on some level, that they are being seen through a screen rather than met in full presence. The thing that makes the empath's version of connection what it is, the complete, undivided, full-body attunement to another human being, requires conditions that social media structurally cannot provide. So when people look at the empath's sparse online presence and interpret it as social failure, they are measuring the wrong thing entirely. They are measuring breadth and finding it lacking without ever asking whether breadth was the point. They are grading the empath on a test the empath never agreed to take, using a scoring system built around values the empath does not share. The empath is not failing at connection. The empath is refusing to dilute it. There is a particular experience that empaths describe, sometimes without the words to fully name it, that captures what they are protecting. It is the experience of sitting with someone, a friend, a partner, a stranger who became something more in the span of a single honest conversation, and feeling in that moment completely known. Not liked, not followed, not engaged with, known. The sense that this other person has seen something real in you and received it and reflected it back without distortion. And you have done the same for them. That experience is rare. It is rare for everyone, but it is especially rare in a world that has decided visibility is the same as intimacy. Empaths know the difference between being seen and being known. They feel the difference in their body. And once you have felt what it means to be truly known by another human being, the shallow warmth of 100 likes from strangers does not fill the same space. It does not even come close. This is why empaths gravitate towards silence in public and depth in private. The silence is not emptiness. It is the space they are holding open for the real thing. It is the refusal to fill the void with substitutes when they know what the real thing feels like and know that they are capable of it. The empath who has 3 people in their life who truly know them is not poor in connection. They are extraordinarily rich in something most people will search for their entire lives and never quite find. Choosing that kind of connection also requires a particular kind of self-awareness that does not come easily and does not come quickly. It requires the empath to know, with clarity, what they actually need, not what the world tells them they should need, not what appears to be working for everyone around them, but what genuinely sustains them. What fills them? What makes them feel most alive and most themselves? That knowledge is the result of years of paying attention to their own experience, noticing what depletes and what restores, learning where they feel real and where they feel like a version of themselves that was constructed for someone else's comfort. That self-knowledge is itself a radical act. Most people never develop it because they never slow down enough to look. They stay in motion, stay in noise, stay in the stream of constant social input that social media provides. And in doing so, They never have to confront the question of what they actually need versus what they have simply gotten used to accepting. The empath, by stepping back, by choosing silence, by refusing to accept the substitute, they force themselves to sit with that question. And the answer, when it comes, reshapes everything. There is also something profound in what the empath's choice says about their relationship with themselves. Social media, at its core, is outward facing. It is built on the premise that your value is confirmed by external reception, by how many people respond, approve, engage, share. The entire architecture of the platform pulls you away from your own center and orients you toward the reactions of others. Over time, for many people, the internal compass gets recalibrated to external feedback. They begin to feel good about themselves when the numbers go up and doubtful about themselves when the numbers go down. The external becomes the measure of the internal. Empaths resist this almost instinctively, not always consciously, but at some level they sense the danger in outsourcing the knowledge of their own worth to a platform's feedback loop. They already know, more acutely than most, how distorting it is when someone else's perception shapes your sense of who you are. They have felt that distortion in real relationships, in real rooms, in real moments where they were misread or dismissed or reduced to something smaller than they were. They are not going to willingly hand that power to an algorithm. The inward turn, the choice to know themselves from the inside rather than from the reflection in other people's engagement, is not narcissism. It is the opposite. It is the development of a stable, grounded sense of self that does not require constant external validation to remain intact. And that kind of stability is precisely what allows the empath to be so fully present for others in the moments that matter, because they are not looking to the other person to tell them who they are. They already know. They bring themselves whole into the connection, and that wholeness is exactly what makes the connection real. The empath's way of connecting will never trend. It will never scale. It will never look impressive from the outside. There will be no metrics for the conversation that lasted 4 hours and changed something permanently. There will be no data point for the moment someone felt truly seen for the first time. There will be no engagement rate for the kind of love that asks nothing of you but your full and honest presence. But the empath knows something that the metrics will never capture. A single moment of real connection outlasts 1,000 moments of being seen, and that is not a consolation prize. That is the whole point.